Welcome to Justice Talks. I'm Matthew Byard. I'm here with the former acting director of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute, Robert Wright. Robert Wright, thank you for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
There's a number of things we're going to discuss here today, mainly the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service and specifically the fair treatment of African Nova Scotians policy, if I've said that correct, the FTANS policy, which was unveiled by the acting director of the current acting director of the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service, Rick Woodburn, in I want to say October. I don't want to get the month wrong, but in 2003 at the Black Cultural Center. You were there for that, correct?
Yes, I attended.
And you've either before then or since, I trust, read the FTANS policy?
I have reviewed it a couple of times, yes.
So first question, how would you describe the FTANS policy? When did you first become aware of it? What involvement, if any, did you have in crafting or creating it in your former role as the acting director of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute? Now that's a mouthful.
Yes, a lot. So I think I would say the FTANS policy has been underway or in development for a couple of years now. So when Martin Hirschhorn was still the director of the Public Prosecution Service, the PPS established a fair treatment of Indigenous persons policy, and just before he left and retired, he released a fair treatment of African Nova Scotians statement, which was kind of a gesture to recognize the need for PPS to do similar work in righting the way they adjudicate and prosecute Black peoples.
Did you work with ANSJI at that time? Did you have a relationship with Martin Hirschhorn?
Well, I did not have a relationship with Mr. Hirschhorn, but I was certainly aware of his presence.
Were you with ANSJI at that time?
Yes, ANSJI was just evolving at that time, and so he retired with that statement. And once that statement had been made, the committee, the Equity Committee at the Barristers Society, individuals mostly inside the PPS, the Public Prosecution Service, and some individuals outside of it were kind of working on turning that statement into a bona fide policy. I didn't have any direct involvement with that, but I was certainly aware of the people who were working on the policy, the people who worked for PPS, who were Indigenous and Black and allies, and individuals who were in the legal community outside of the PPS who were kind of tapped to support and review drafts of it. I'm not a lawyer, so I certainly was, I guess I'd say, a cheerleader to the development of the policy, but wasn't actively involved in its development.
And it's about just short of 20 pages long, I believe?
Yeah, about that, I think. Yeah, 21 pages maybe.
What do you think of it? How would you describe it to someone who's never read it, and what do you think about it?
Well, I would say that I celebrate that there is a policy. I think that the policy we should understand is an evidence and a recognition that there is a problem. Systemic racism is alive and well in our systems in Nova Scotia, and we shouldn't be surprised that systemic racism is alive and well in the Public Prosecution Service.
Some people, sorry to cut you off, but some people hear that and they tune out immediately. You know, they roll their eyes to the notion of systemic racism. What is that?
Well, systemic racism is just the idea that the institutions that run our society were created at a time when women did not have a voice in our society, and certainly Indigenous people and Black people did not have a voice in our society, and certainly even LGBTQIA people, queer folk, didn't have a voice in our society.
But they do now.
But all of the policies, all of the institutions, all of the pre-service education that people get to work in these jobs, all of that was created and formed without us. And so that means that these systems and their policies and their ways of operating were designed without considering black people, indigenous people, and the like. And so that absence of our concerns within those systems upon their formation won't change unless we proactively work to change it. So, so that's what we mean by systemic racism, the kinds of things that are baked into systems that exclude different people.
And really quickly, would you argue or claim that maybe this is why black people, Native people are overrepresented in prison, for example? Is that how it plays out, or
yes.
does it play out in other ways, or is
that's clearly how it plays out. I mean, I think that we only need to look at the Marshall inquiry, you know, the inquiry into the wrongful conviction of Donald Marshall Jr., an indigenous young man hanging out in a park with an African Nova Scotian young man.
Where was that?
This was in Cape Breton. They encounter two older white men, and the black young man is stabbed and killed, and Donald Marshall Jr. was wrongfully convicted for that. And when he was incarcerated, and years later, when they inquired into his wrongful conviction, he was later exonerated, and one of the men who was one of the white men was charged and ultimately convicted of the crime. The inquiry said that Donald Marshall Jr. encountered racism in every step of that process, from his first contact with the men in the park to his first contact with the police, all the way through to his exoneration and the compensation plan that was developed, in which he was accused of being largely responsible for his wrongful conviction. So the inquiry was very clear and outlined that systemic racism is alive and well in the justice system, and that we needed to address that. And so the recommendations that came out of that report were aimed at addressing systemic racism. So I would say that these policies are the latest efforts to address the systemic racism that has become evident within PPS. So the Marshall inquiry occurred in the late 80s. That work began then. The Public Prosecution Service became one of the recommendations, and certainly one of the things that arose out of the Marshall inquiry was that the Public Prosecution Service was separated out from the Department of Justice and became Canada's first independent public prosecution service, in order to shield it from political influence and the like. That was seen as one of the solutions to some of the problems that existed, but in my view, the Public Prosecution Service didn't use that independence to aggressively address the systemic racism that existed in prosecutorial and policing practices. In fact, it might be said that they kind of used their independence to resist the shift towards diversity, equity, and inclusion that we've seen in most government and public systems over the last 30 years.
So was Martin Hirschhorn's aim, I guess, to address that through the FTANS policy? Is that your understanding? To correct that, perhaps?
I would say that the Public Prosecution Service over the last 4 or 5 years has been under tremendous external pressure to address the systemic racism that exists in PPS, and that Martin Hirschhorn's development of the fair treatment policies and statements was in response to that pressure. I think that that's important to say, because I do not believe, and this is just my opinion, but from my position I would say that PPS has been proactively adopting and advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion, and certainly not anti-racism in its operations.
Well, the FTANS policy, as we talked about, it's fairly new.
Yes.
Was unveiled last year. After reading it, what do you think are the best parts about it?
Well, I'd back up a little bit, because we can't talk about the FTANS policy and talk about its unveiling and its rolling out since the October without remembering that it was an attempt. There was an attempt to roll that policy out in May of 2023.
An attempt, you said.
An attempt. So Martin Hirschhorn had retired in 2022. There were a number of individuals who had served in the role of acting director after his retirement. And all of this time, I think that the committee inside of PPS was working on the policy. And when Denise Smith was the acting director of PPS in 2023, they attempted to roll out the policy in February or May of that year. And when it was shared largely in PPS in advance of a training day that was designed to bring Black community members and leaders in the legal community together with the staff at the Public Prosecution Service to roll out the policy and discuss the policy and begin to understand the nature of systemic racism and how it plays and what the policy is designed to do, that at that point there was a revolt against the policy, and it was withdrawn from being implemented, and members of the Equity Committee who were instrumental in developing the policy and planning that day were removed from the Equity Committee, and it was a dramatic demonstration of resistance against the policy from staff at the PPS.
You used the term revolt. That strikes me. People didn't want to see, I guess, race relations or systemic racism removed from PPS. What do you mean specifically by when you say there was a revolt?
Well, I think that when the plan to have a day where community members and legal leaders and PPS were together, there were some individuals who were supposed to be a part of that day who had lived experience with the criminal justice system, who had been actively prosecuted, who were now in the Black community doing very productive and proactive work. There were emails exchanged, questioning among PPS employees, questioning the value of the contribution of those members, questioning the safety of
specifically because of their past criminal convictions?
Yes, because of their past involvements.
Is that a valid criticism?
I would say that in most places now where we are delivering services to the public, and we have systems that meet the needs of the public, hearing first voice experience when you're designing policies and looking at your system, it's standard. You know, if you're going to review income assistance policies, you need to have people who are on income assistance who you're engaging with. If you're doing child welfare policy, you have to talk to families that have been involved with child welfare. Health, you need to have people who've accessed health services. Well, PPS prosecutes people. So to have people who had been prosecuted by PPS, people in the Black community, Black people from the Black community who were not just individuals who had been prosecuted, but also people who were making positive and productive change in their community. These are people who are very active in serving their community. their previous brushes with the law or convictions notwithstanding. So, and I guess I would say that these individuals didn't invite themselves to that training day. They were chosen by the committee that was charged with the responsibility for rolling out that day.
So do you think that the people who, as you put it, revolted, was their objection more so to these specific people more so than it was against the FTANS policy itself and the notion that systemic racism exists within PPS?
Well, I think that the tale on that has not yet fully been written.
Okay.
These are public servants exchanging emails through their public service emails, expressing concerns about the rollout of a policy, and I know that all of that correspondence is subject to FOIPOP, and I have not read all of that correspondence, but I would say it would be fair to say that some of it was inflammatory.
So when that happened, and to my understanding, the day still took place, but some folks didn't attend.
Yes.
Maybe there were some arguments in the room, but the fair treatment of African Nova Scotians policy, it still existed. Was a directive given, to hold off on implementing anything that was suggested in it until further notice?
It was halted. The makeup of the committee that had designed it was changed, and then the policy was revisited, and substantial changes were recommended.
Like what? What are some of the major ones?
Well, I'm not as well versed in that. What I would say,
changes were made since the first attempt at a rollout versus the second rollout.
Well, let me suggest that the initial policy, after what I've described as a revolt occurred, there was a change in the committee responsible for it. There were proposed changes, and then there was a change in the acting director of the Public Prosecution Service. And Karen Hudson, former deputy minister, was appointed to serve as acting executive director. That would have been in the summer of 2023. And she, I think shortly after her arrival, just put pause on the whole thing and said, okay, let's just chill our jets here, and let's look at make up the committee and see how were those changes made. And she began to reverse some of that reaction to the FTANS policy.
Did you read the first version?
Yes, I read a draft of the first version. It's very substantially similar to the current version, the active version, but like I said, there was a drawing away from that version after the first attempt to roll out, and then there were some changes in PPS. Like I said, the appointment of Karen Hudson, and then the appointment of Angela Johnson, who was drafted from the Public Service Commission to serve in a senior equity role in PPS.
Not as acting director of PPS, but her role was that of the executive lead of the Equity and Strategic Relations, I guess, department.
Yes, yes.
So as it stands now, having read the current version of the FTANS policy, what stands out to you as the best parts about it? What parts stand out to you? You have the most criticisms of, if any, minor or major, and what the pros or the cons, which one weighs each other over?
Well, I guess, and again, I'd say I'm not a legal practitioner, but from my read of the policy, what I would say is the strongest value of the policy is that it acknowledges this problem with systemic racism and the need for PPS to have a lens on their work that is proactively addressing systemic racism and ensuring that the practice at PPS is designed to spot systemic racism and the over-prosecution and the over-adjudication of black people, and to use tools that are the discretionary tools at PPS to advance equity and fairness in public prosecution.
What's the difference between that and what was said in the Marshall inquiry?
Well, I think that the Marshall inquiry recognized the problem. The fair treatment policy begins to lay out practices to support PPS and its employees in understanding how to address the systemic racism. So, for example, the policy describes how the Public Prosecution Service should use alternative measures for adjudication how to properly use its discretion at various stages in the public prosecution process. So for example, at arraignment and at bail, and when giving direction to police and things like that are highly technical, that in terms of the work that's going on there. But one of the things that's in the policy is the idea that the equity committee within the PPS can be a place where prosecutors can bring cases where black folk are being adjudicated, to review the case with the committee to say, hey, what are some of my options in this file, so that prosecutors can be supported and even supported in their considerations of how to properly adjudicate situations in which race is a factor in which black folk are being adjudicated.
So the policy suggests that that's an option for prosecutors. What if prosecutors simply don't want to do that? Are they directed to do that as per the policy?
Well, I would say that would be one of the weaknesses in the policies. Whenever you have a policy that establishes a process that may be used rather than must be used, then you're opening up the door to discretion that can be used perhaps in an ill-informed way, or in a way that isn't as informed about the nature of anti-black racism as we might like.
So do you know or think that the policy can or should be tweaked in that way to make it less so of a suggestion, more so as a directive? Or maybe you don't have an opinion on that?
I really don't think that at this stage that tweaking the policy is the issue. I think the idea that the Public Prosecution Service has this policy and acknowledges the nature of anti-black racism and systemic racism in the public prosecution work is a tremendous advancement. Having an equity committee that has a job of helping their colleagues to bring that policy to life, fantastic. The idea that the Public Prosecution Service now has a senior individual at the executive table whose job is to continue to advise and inform the executive around issues of equity and inclusion and anti-racism, fantastic. I think for me, the issue now is for us to see that policy alive and in action. And organizations like the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute, who are lawyers who are representing black people out there in real time, will be able to use that policy when negotiating and discussing cases with prosecutors. And in time, we will see whether or not the policy is making the change that we had all hoped for. So I think that for me, I'm in a state of let's wait and see. Let's see how the policy is implemented. Could it be improved? Absolutely, it could be improved. But I'm less concerned about the minutia in the policy at this point, and more concerned about how Public Prosecution Service embraces this acknowledgement and this way of practicing differently.
All right. So all is well then, it would seem.
Well,
as it relates to the Public Prosecution Service.
Well, I think that there are two things, I guess, that really concern me currently in the Public Prosecution Service.
Two things?
Two things. I think that people need to understand that systemic racism at the Public Prosecution Service doesn't simply exist because Robert Wright says it exists, right? The Marshall Inquiry made it clear that it existed. And there have been internal rumblings at Public Prosecution Service for the entirety of its existence as an independent organization since 1990 that Black and Indigenous people weren't being able to advance within the Public Prosecution Service.
And I believe you told me there was a specific, I guess, investigation into that. Is that correct?
Yes.
But that there's no information or report on that.
There was.
Not to get ahead of you.
No.
Those two things you wanted to bring up.
I guess what I'm saying is that so there had been concerns, not just about how the Public Prosecution Service adjudicates or prosecutes Black people, but also how they hire and treat the people that work in the Public Prosecution Service. So up until fairly recently, there had never been a Black or Indigenous person in a managing role as a lawyer in Public Prosecution Service or at the executive table of the Public Prosecution Service.
And what's the executive table?
Well, that would be the senior leaders of the director, the deputy director, the senior folk who actually run the Public Prosecution Service.
But what do they do? Because they don't prosecute cases themselves, do they? What do they do day to day?
Well, they manage and give direction to the Public Prosecution Service.
Okay.
Right. So, for example,
a wide number of things.
Yeah. So, like every organization has a senior administration, and there has been no racial diversity at the senior administration in the Public Prosecution Service until fairly recently. I think David Curry was the first person to be appointed to a managing role.
Were they resistant to let folks in?
Well, I won't.
People of color.
I won't paint that with any particular flavor, other than to say, if we look at organizations in the public sector in North America today, there is a recognition that if we are going to have, if we're going to address the systemic racism that exists in our society, that our public institutions need to have representation of diverse individuals at the highest level of organizations. I noticed that Dalhousie University just appointed a provost and academic vice president who is a Black woman. As an example, there is a recognition that institutions, if they want to develop their capacity to truly serve the whole population, they're going to need to have people in senior administration who understand the needs of a diversity of people. And so the PPS has not done that until just a half minute ago, if you will.
And you said David Curry, what is his role in the...
I think he's a managing lawyer at PPS in his region.
Roughly how many managing lawyers do you think they have?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know, but I would say that in each region there would be a managing lawyer, and I don't know how many regions the PPS would have. So I wouldn't even have.
So there's still a number of regions that still don't have diversity.
Yes. Yes, he's the only one, to my knowledge. So the two things. Number one is having folk in leadership at PPS who have a commitment to diversity and a role to continue to support PPS and its evolution in that regard. As we mentioned, Angela Johnson had served was drafted from the Public Service Commission to come into PPS to serve as a senior advisor in that regard. But she has since left.
I was just going to say, I understand she's since left. Is there been a replacement? Does that role require, on paper, I guess, a person of color to be in the role? Or maybe you don't know.
I would imagine that such a role ought to be designated, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure the reasons for her leaving, and I'm not sure what the process is for her replacement, or if there is an intention to replace her.
But you can't say she hasn't been replaced as of yet?
I do not believe she has been replaced as of the taping today. So I'm concerned about that. Anyone who has been tracking PPS, who knows that in its history there has been this problem of systemic racism, who understands that the fair treatment of Indigenous persons and fair treatment of African Nova Scotians policies were implemented due to external pressures on the Public Prosecution Service to improve its game. Anyone who has been tracking the fact that the fair treatment of African Nova Scotians policy was not universally embraced, but that there was a tremendous kind of turmoil in its implementation initially, for sure. Anybody who knows that the Public Service Commission actually commissioned a study of systemic racist hiring practices at PPS, a report that has been not released to the public and that has not been released even to us at ANSJI, even though we FOI-popped it. Anyone who's watching and sees an individual, a senior individual from the Public Service Commission, go into the Public Prosecution Service and serve only a brief period of time before leaving in a senior role advising around equity, anyone who sees these things should be concerned, right? And so I'm concerned about that, about the lack of filling that role and the outstanding documented concerns around systemic racism in PPS with no one now responsible for unpacking that. That's my first concern. My second concern is that we are still, Martin Hirschhorn retired in 2022, we are now in 2024, and we are still working with an acting director of the Public Prosecution Service.
You mentioned Denise Smith, I believe.
Yes.
Karen Hudson.
Yes.
The current acting director, I'm not sure if there was one in between Karen Hudson and the current one, but was Rick Woodburn.
Yeah.
Who Angela Johnson introduced at the Black Cultural Center when they released the current version of the FTANS policy. Rick Woodburn also attended the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute's Justice Symposium that I understand Angela Johnson also helped set up. But you say he's the acting director, but he is serving in the role.
He's serving in the role of acting director. And my criticism of the Public Prosecution Service and this government that ultimately is responsible for appointing the director of the Public Prosecution Service is that, given all of the history that I've articulated, given that since Marshall, the issue of systemic racism in the criminal justice system must be top of mind for anyone administering in that regard. Given that systemic racism in practice and in operations at PPS has been under review by the Public Service Commission, and there is a report sitting on someone's desk somewhere that outlines that in detail. It is reasonable that the next director of the Public Prosecution Service would be a senior individual who comes to this service already having significant credentials of being able to administer an organization with equity and fair treatment of racialized and indigenous peoples in mind, a known entity who is a proven champion of these issues. And I would just say it frankly, that Rick Woodburn is not such a person.
But he's the acting director.
He is the acting director.
When do you know or anticipate that will be made a permanent director?
Well, that's the concern. He was appointed as the acting director for a period of 6 months. The province of Nova Scotia engaged a search committee, a human resource committee or company to do a search for the new director of the public prosecution
for a
service.
permanent director?
For a permanent director.
They've done this after Rick Woodburn came on as the acting director?
Yes.
Okay.
And
is that standard in terms of filling the role of a permanent director?
I think that government often uses executive search teams to hire this senior public servants. That's a fairly common practice.
And not to cut you off or go back, why wasn't that done to your understanding when Martin Hirschhorn retired? Or maybe it's not no concern to you? I don't know.
That's a good question. You know, we're 2 years since Martin has left, and we've had a series of acting directors, and only recently, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7, maybe more months ago, was this company commissioned to do the search. And I know that they were commissioned to do the search because one of the things that search committees do when they're looking to fill a position is they will contact senior people in the jurisdiction of that the position will serve and give them a survey and ask them questions. What do you think is important to see in the next director of the Public Prosecution Service? What do you think are the challenges? And then I was the acting director of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute. I was called by the search committee, as I've been called by other search committees. The search committee that looked into hiring the new chief of police and other senior persons. I'm a senior practitioner in the health and human service and justice sector in Nova Scotia. It would be reasonable that I would be called to, and so I was called, and so I know the process was underway.
So in terms of the process then, so they're looking to appoint someone rather than have people apply for the position?
Well, I think that the search committee would go ahead and advertise that they're looking for the person, but they're establishing what the criteria of screening and the interviewing would be. And to my knowledge, they had that search, they interviewed people, and there was no announcement coming from government informing us, and when I say us, I mean the public, of what the outcome is. So
maybe they're still looking for someone.
Well,
maybe they have someone in mind.
They had appointed Rick
day.
Woodburn for 6 months, and after his 6-month term was coming to an end, they reappointed him as acting director for 18 months.
Where were they in terms of the search at that time when they reappointed him?
There is no transparency. So there was no announcement to the public that said, you know, we have engaged in a search and the search has failed. We're planning another search in the spring or the fall. There's nothing. All we know is that Rick Woodburn was appointed as acting. We know that a search was undertaken, and there has been no reporting back to the community, to the public, about what the outcome of that search was. And then Rick Woodburn was reappointed for an additional 18 months.
And so he's a senior prosecutor with Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service.
Yes.
Why is it your understanding that he was the one who was appointed, and why do you say he's not the right person for the position, at least in terms of the permanent position?
Well, I would say that the appointment of senior civil servants to different roles is something that is opaque to the public. We don't know. We just hear there's an announcement, someone's been appointed as deputy minister, another deputy minister has moved from this department to another department, okay. And the director of public prosecution service kind of serves at almost like a deputy ministerial level of,
Okay.
of and so, yeah, there isn't a lot of transparency in that process to us here in the public. But I would say that given the significant concerns that certainly the black community has had about the Public Prosecution Service over the last several years, many years actually, it wouldn't be inappropriate for the public to be informed, right? I say Rick Woodburn, I question the appropriateness of him in that role at this time in our history. I think that if you consider what has been happening in the justice sector in North America over the last several years, everyone would have to agree that the issue of the fair treatment of people of African descent and the fair treatment of Indigenous peoples must be the number one priority in criminal justice service delivery today. Think about it. We have missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the lack of our justice system in pursuing and in investigating these clear crimes against Indigenous people that is happening en masse across the country, and Indigenous people are concerned that the police, the prosecution service, the courts aren't doing enough to protect Indigenous peoples. We see, ever since George Floyd, a heightened recognition in North America that policing is problematic on the street as it interacts with people with racialized people. We have street checks, and the fact that street checks were disproportionately used against people of African descent in this jurisdiction, 5 or 6 times more frequently stopped than members of the public at large. Mm-hmm. No one can be doing anything in the justice field today without acknowledging that there is a high priority on addressing the systemic racism that exists in these systems. And if we're recognizing that, then we should be hiring chiefs of police, directors of public service. We should be appointing judges with an understanding that we need to bring into these services knowledgeable, proven individuals who understand how to address these problems so that our justice systems from stem to stern can be just, and as well as promoting public safety among all populations.
And so, getting back to Rick Woodburn, who's the current acting director, so I mean, he is the one who, I guess, unveiled the policy at the Black Cultural Center. He was a guest of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute at the recent Justice Symposium. There were 2 panel discussions that took place. One was on the defining African Nova Scotians as a distinct people. One was specifically talking about the fair treatment of African Nova Scotians policy, which Rick Woodburn was part of that discussion, along with Brandon Roll, who works for ANSJI, and Vanessa Fells, who works for the Barrister Society. Now, following the panel discussion, he was asked a lot of questions, critical questions about, I guess, the FTANS policy. Some of what he said in response to that, I just want to read it here. He talked about, learning to understand a lot of the things you're talking about and working towards that. Speaking about the FTANS policy, specifically, he said, we're looking for training of all of our prosecutors over the next couple months. We have scenario-based training that we're actually doing. We're working with the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute to do scenario-based training with our prosecutors, also other training, and we're keeping track, right now at least, of the amount of consultations there are. We can't release that info, we can't release what they're about, of course, but we're having the consultations. Maybe we can release the type of cases. We'll have to look at that. It's a new policy. We're working it out. We also have a case file management system where we should be able to start tracking some of these metrics so we can find out, for example, how many people we've sent to restorative justice, how many people who are African Nova Scotian that we sent to restorative justice, what the outcomes are there, things like that. The stats moving along in the system, we can't keep stats on some of it, but we're going to do the best we can so that there are metrics and so that we can have that positive outlook. And if we have the same conversation a year from now, we can start to have that conversation about trust and hopefully turn this thing around. So, I mean, what's wrong with that? He's only the acting director. If they're still looking for someone, maybe they select him and he's the right person for the job. Maybe they select someone else.
Yes. First of all, I'd say that anyone who's serving as an acting director has to be prepared to fully implement the role. I don't think that that anyone should see themselves as a simple caretaker. So the idea that he's acting is no excuse for lack of action. The other thing I would say is that I've been a senior administrator in different systems. And as a senior administrator in systems, you need to understand what your activity drivers are. You know, what are the things that cause us to be busy? Where do those things occur? If we were wanting to reform or to change our organization, we would need to know where the places are that we would apply our energy in order to seek change, and we would need to have the capacity to understand our system well enough to know what the metrics are that will show us that we're getting the change.
And he says, you know, those metrics are yet to come. They're collecting them, I guess, as we speak.
Yes, I would say that the absence of metrics in a system as large and as complex and as critical as PPS, to think that in 2024 they're just now developing metrics to measure their performance is problematic.
But they are developing them now, though.
Yes. The idea that, and I was present at that time when he spoke about these things. In fact, I asked very specifically, what are the metrics that you're looking to? And so I think his comments were in response to a question. And my sense was that he was guessing at the metrics that he would be looking at that point. Here we are, a couple of months since that time, and I'm unaware of any involvement that the ANSJI has had in any meetings, consultations, or plans to support PPS's rollout of the fair treatment policy.
And I was going to ask you that because you're the former, I guess, acting director of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute, but you're a special advisor to the current
Yes.
director, Shauna Paris-Hoyt. So you say you're not aware of PPS being involved in some of the stuff he talked about. They were going to be involved with ANSJI. Would you be aware if that was the case?
I think I'd be aware if, the senior team at ANSJI would be aware, because I think that we inform each other on a weekly basis of the major issues that are occurring within our organization and in our partnering organizations. And we have not, since that symposium, we have not heard any reports of any involvements that we've had with PPS in following up on the FTANS policy.
Because to go back on, I guess, the part you're talking about, we have scenario-based training that we're doing, working with the African Nova Scotia Justice Institute, with our prosecutors. Why would he say that they're going to do that and then nothing has happened since then? Or
that's a good question. I could only speculate.
But I mean, without asking you what your theory is, do you have a theory, multiple theories, or do you anticipate that there will be work, collaborative work going forward?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute has a very clear mandate. We have been established in order to address the systemic anti-black racism that exists in the justice system on large. We produce impact of race and culture assessments here, which are an influential tool that are being used to bring a deeper understanding of black people's lived experiences to the courts before black people are sentenced by courts in Nova Scotia.
And to cut in, there was a decision made by the, correct me if I'm wrong, the appeals court that basically a precedent-setting case that made those mandatory now when sentencing African Nova Scotians.
Yes,
correct?
Yes. The Anderson case here in Nova Scotia is the law of the land, and it essentially said that when you're adjudicating or sentencing a black person, you must take into consideration the fact that you're sentencing a black person, and the best way to gain the information you need to take that into consideration is through an IRCA.
And when that was made mandatory, it was, I believe, Brandon Rowe from the Institute who spoke at the hearing on behalf of the Institute?
Yes, it was actually, that hearing took place before the Justice Institute was established, and so he was still a lawyer at Legal Aid, and he was representing the Decade for People of African Descent Coalition as an intervener on that appeal case. And yes, but
he's
Brandon
now
Roll,
he's now with the Institute.
Now,
right.
Yes, he's a senior lawyer at the Justice Institute, the director.
And
of
he was in that same panel discussion with Rick Woodburn. Say that 5 times fast.
Yeah.
So why has there been no collaboration since, or will there be?
Well, as I was saying, the Justice Institute, we have as our mandate to address these issues. We have been working on issues related to policing. We have been certainly working with issues related to the sentencing and the courts, and it would make perfect sense for us to be working collaboratively with the Public Prosecution Service in the delivery of, or in bringing to life this policy, and to support the training of their staff.
Both the Liberal provincial government, the former Liberal provincial government, and the current Conservative government both have expressed support for the Institute. So
it's both advanced funding for the Institute.
It's not a partisan sort of institute or
No, it's not a partisan institute. It was established as a community-based, a black community-based nonprofit to advance these things because the black community has such a wide agenda for advocating for the community on justice issues that establishing an institute made sense. And we weren't initially funded by government, but once the government realized that, the provincial government realized that this is really a part of their mandate, and that the federal government had announced that they were implementing a Canadian black justice strategy, then the provincial government here in Nova Scotia advanced the development of a black Nova Scotian justice policy. And of course, if you're going to advance a policy like that, or a program like that, and there's a Justice Institute that you have not yet demonstrated your support to, they came on board and supported the Institute. And I think we've had a very productive working relationship with the provincial government, but the nature of the relationship is going to be tense, because the government manages systems, and the Justice Institute is designed to combat systemic racism in those systems.
The government is
And
paying the institute to hold it to account. I mean,
basically, yes.
It's a bit of a catch-22.
Yes.
Is it, or is that overstated?
Well, I think that's how systems change,
Okay.
right? When Canada patriated its constitution and established the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, the federal government at the time established a thing called the Court Challenges Program. Basically, the federal government said, hey, we now have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it's useless unless people use the Charter to challenge this country to bring alive the commitment to these rights. And so the federal government established the Court Challenges Program that actually funded litigation against government to advance charter rights, because the government understood that as the keeper of the system, they are not in a very good position to challenge itself. And so they funded individuals who were advancing charter rights issues in order to enliven the charter. So the federal government understood that it was going to be funding those individuals who would then bring litigation against it in order to advance the charter rights in Canada. So there is this dynamic tension. Of course the Public Prosecution Service wants to do better, but unless there is external pressure and external direction as to how to do better, they will not be able to do this work. It's not like they have said, oh, systemic racism is rampant in our organization, let us discharge 50% of our employees and hire 50% new employees and make sure that all of those employees are already dedicated, committed champions of equity issues in law, so that we can ensure that we're going to make these things happen. Of course they couldn't do that. The public prosecution service lawyers are people who've been employed and who have been honestly advancing the work of the service as they have been directed by previous administrations, and as they have been directed by the kind of the social contract mandate that they've believed that they've had. But in recent years, we've recognized that there are some fundamental flaws with that mandate, and that mandate is not inclusive and is actually discriminatory. And so now we have a fair treatment policy that is designed to kind of shake up practice and help the system be more critical in their operations, and even establishing a group within the Public Prosecution Service who can help prosecutors be more competent when it comes to this kind of practice.
Right, and those prosecutors are now being directed by Rick Woodburn, the acting director of the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service, who I assume would have been on board with everything that you've just said, going into the Justice Symposium again, where he said that going forward, he's going to be working with the Institute to implement the FTANS policy. You've said that hasn't happened since then. You can only speculate as to why. That's. Have you? Do you have a theory? I mean, without, maybe you don't want to share the theory, but do you have a theory? What are folks supposed to make about that? Make of that, rather.
And like I said, I've been the director of systems before, and when you're in that role, of course, you are responsible for hearing the voices that are telling you that you don't have it all right.
Which is what he indicated himself.
Yes, but I think that managing that tension is a significant challenge in any institution and for any leader, right? Because the Justice Institute and other members of the Black community are now very vigorously challenging the Public Prosecution Service to do right by us, the black community.
He welcomed that challenge.
I think that he has said that, but I'm not sure if his actions have demonstrated that he is personally and professionally up to the rigor of that challenge.
And this is why you don't feel he's qualified to stay on as permanent director?
I'd say in a word, yes.
Have you spoken with him since the Justice Symposium?
No, I have not.
Should you? Maybe there's something you can't say. I mean, you're no longer the director of the
I'm
institute.
no
so
longer the
you can't.
executive director of the Justice Institute, but I will just say this, because in addition to being the senior the advisor to the Justice Institute, I'm also a senior practitioner in this province. I'm the person who pioneered impact of race and culture assessments. I have brought that work into the Justice Institute, but in some ways am still leading that work nationally in this country. I'm a person who feels a certain responsibility to speak up and use my voice to hold systems accountable for the work that they're doing and not doing. I've certainly done that in other places and at other times when I have gone publicly on the record about my perception of how courts are functioning in Canada, how the appointment of judges has been working in Canada and here in Nova Scotia, how how police leadership is responding properly or improperly in this jurisdiction and in other jurisdictions across the country. So I have been a fairly regular public commentator on health, human service, and justice affairs. Mm-hmm. And from that position, I have been able to maintain good relationships with most of the people in those systems that I comment about when those individuals are professional, capable individuals who understand the dynamic tension that must exist between them in their senior administrative roles within systems and me, a senior member of the African Nova Scotian community who works in these sectors and regularly gives public commentary about how things should be better. I have been able to work with different people from different parties in government, maintaining respectful relations, even if there are moments and times when our interactions will be tense because of the degree of advocacy that I am applying in their direction. I have not felt from Rick Woodburn the same level of ability to engage even in the face of the essential structural tension that exists between him and his role and me and my role in the community.
In your former role as acting director of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute, what was your relationship like with him then?
He he had just become acting director of the Public Prosecution Service when I was getting ready to step down as acting director of the Justice Institute. And so we really didn't have a strong working relationship with me in that role and he in his.
Did you work more closely with Karen Hudson prior to that?
Yes.
Who was the director when you came on? Was it Denise Smith or Karen Hudson?
Well, I think that
I'm trying to work with a timeline.
Yeah, I would say that when Linda Lee Oland, Linda Oland, who was the former justice of the appeal court of Nova Scotia, appeal court here in Nova Scotia, was an acting director of PPS for a short while. And I had very positive and significant engagements with her, though she was in the role for a short period of time. And I think Denise was in the role a short period of time, and that was when the FTANS policy fiasco occurred last May, or May of 2023. So I didn't have a lot of engagement with her. I did have a lot of engagement with Karen Hudson, though she was only with us for a short time. She had to leave the role as a result of a medical condition. But
your relationship with Rick Woodburn was brief in terms of the timeline as to when.
Yes,
you
I
left
would
or when
say
you came in.
that Karen Hudson, as a former deputy minister and as a person who was the former director of Nova Scotia Legal Aid, was used to that level of critical engagement with a key stakeholder in the community. I would say that would be fair to characterize her as an individual who leaned into that relationship and did everything in her power to nurture it and to use it to support her in the work that she had to do in the Public Prosecution Service, at the same time that she was very sensitive to her responsibilities of managing and supporting staff at PPS.
And correct me if I'm wrong, though, didn't you say that she was the one who put the FTANS policy sort of on hold and put it to the side?
She's the person who put all of the changes that were being planned in the FTANS policy after the fiasco in May of 2023. She's the one who kind of put things on hold and reversed some of the decisions around the changing.
That sounds like it might contradict some of what you just said about her.
Well, I think she was doing that in a very positive and proactive way, because after what had happened in May, the policy and the process was, I would say, thrown in disarray, and she came on board and kind of settled that a little bit and brought leadership back to that policy development, and was instrumental in working to see Angela Johnson appointed in the PPS in a senior role as an equity advisor.
And so just to get a timeline going forward, at what point does Rick Woodburn's current term set to end? When do you know or anticipate a permanent director will be announced? Can it happen prior to then? Do they have to have them in place for when his term ends? Could his term be extended? What do you anticipate will happen with, again, I guess, the leadership of the Public Prosecution Service?
Well,
what do you hope will happen?
I would hope that those responsible for filling the position in a permanent basis, and that would be, of course, the Attorney General and the Department of Justice, and of course the cabinet of this government. I would hope that they would go back to the table and lean into a vigorous and process for finding and appointing the executive, a director of Public Prosecution Service for this time, an individual who brings with them significant credentials, not only as a senior legal practitioner, but also as a person who is a competent and proven champion of equity and just equity and in the delivery of criminal justice services in Canada. I think there are some people out there who could do that work. I think some of those folk were probably interviewed. So it's still curious to me why that appointment process was halted and Rick was extended in the role.
So if it was halted, I think a lot of people are going to hear this for the first time. Black people in this province, I believe it's 3%, perhaps less. So it's not as if this can be say a major issue, say come election time or anything like that. If there was the other investigation into the hiring practices of the Public Prosecution Service, where you say a report exists, but hasn't been made public despite FOIPOP requests, people who are hearing all this for the first time, I mean, what is the average black person on the street supposed to do about this? What can we do about this? It seems like it just is what it is.
We should not say that because black folk are only 3 to 5% of the population of Nova Scotia, then this is a minor issue. What I would say is, when it comes to asking the question, does your justice system respect the charter rights of the citizens of this province? In answer to that question, we need to understand that Indigenous people and black people are the metaphorical canary in the coal mine.
What does that mean?
What it means is, you know, when in the old days when people used to work in mines, the question is the air good enough to breathe down there? And so they would put a canary in a cage and take it down in the cage with them. And if the canary died, it was probably a good idea to get out of the mine.
Okay.
Right?
This is the bird you're talking about?
Yes, a bird, a canary. So what I'm saying is, the evidence of injustice in our justice system is seen most clearly in its treatment of racialized people, in this province, particularly black and Indigenous people. Think about the street checks issue. Street checks was a standard operating procedure of police that disproportionately targeted black people, 5 to 1.
Right.
Even though black people are a smaller part of the population, we were dramatically overrepresented in that statistic. And it was the black community that rose up and said, hey, a couple of things. A, the use of this practice is racist, and B, the use of the practice is illegal anyway. And we advocated for the Wortley report, and then we advocated for an independent legal evaluation of the street check practice. And what we found was that street checks as a practice was illegal. So we didn't say street checks as a practice against black people is illegal. Street checks as a practice against all Nova Scotians is illegal. And so it was the black community advocating for its rights that was able to overturn a policy that was a policy and practice of police that was actually violating the rights of all Nova Scotians. And so if our justice system, if our public prosecution system, just as an example, is unfairly prosecuting blacks and Indigenous people in this province, then we have to be concerned about whether or not our public prosecution service is actually respecting the rights of Nova Scotian citizens in its operation, right? And that just because, so people shouldn't think, well, it's only negatively affecting black people.
I'm white, I'll be all right.
Just like street checks, even though black people were disproportionately counted in those stats, the majority of people whose rights were violated by street checks were white people. And so our agitation stopped the practice that was harming all Nova Scotians. And similarly, as we continue to look at systemic racism in the public prosecution service, that is an issue that has implications for all Nova Scotians who will find themselves someday in a courtroom with a public prosecutor from this province advancing a prosecution against them. It's not just something that black people need to be worried about or Indigenous people need to be worried about. All Nova Scotians need to worry about whether or not the justice system is delivering true justice, or whether there are classes of people who are being unfairly treated.
I won't keep you. I'll say I was in a meeting recently. Someone talked about optimism. They said if you're pessimistic, say, going into a situation, then anything that happens is sort of anything negative that happens will be sort of maybe overblown in your mind. So it's important to be optimistic, maybe reasonably optimistic. A year from now, where do you see us a year from now? How optimistic are you?
Well, I'm eternally optimistic on this point, recognizing that we've already established the need for change. The change is inevitable. So, for example, it was in 2003 that Kirk Johnson advanced his human rights complaint about driving while black, right? And it was the 2003 Kirk Johnson decision that made police start keeping race-based statistics on their traffic stops and street checks. Now, the Human Rights Tribunal found that there was systemic racism in the stops that Mr. Johnson suffered. They recognized that this could be a larger program. They said that the police had to keep stats and that they had to do a study to unpack the racism in the practice. So we won. Now, mind you, the police sat on that directive, kept the statistics, but didn't study the statistics until the black community agitated and CBC FOI-popped the data that had been kept, and we found this dramatic overrepresentation of black folks. So
the street checks data.
The street checks, yeah.
Right.
So Kirk Johnson won his case in 2003. Fast forward in 2019, when we advocated and the Human Rights Commission did hire Scott Wortley to do the report, and the report was thorough and recognized the practice that was problematic, we won that. Later on, when we recognized that Scott Wortley, as a socio-legal scholar, was not able to comment on the legality of the practice, we again advocated for the Human Rights Commission to commission an academic to do the study that had been ordered in 2003. And Scott Wortley came and he did his study, and the study demonstrated even more clearly how the practice was problematic. Then we advocated for because he couldn't do as a socio-legal scholar, he couldn't do the legal analysis, we advocated for them to hire someone to do an independent legal opinion, and they hired former Chief Justice McDonald to do that study, and sure enough, the practice was found illegal. And so then the province had to put a moratorium on the practice. So we have been winning every single time we are in the fight, we win. The problem is we have to keep fighting in order for each implementation of these remedies get implemented.
So what does the average black Nova Scotian who hears this, what should they do? What can or should they do if they want to get more involved? And I mean, it sounds like it's hard work, but necessary work, I guess, the way you describe it.
Well, I think that every Nova Scotian should be concerned that our justice system is truly just and should be advocating for governments at all levels, because of course policing is administered municipally and the Department of Justice is administered provincially, and the appointment of federal judges in Nova Scotia is done federally. So Nova Scotians should be talking to all of their politicians, asking them, hey, where do you come down on the rights of people in the justice system? Are you ensuring that the rights of citizens of this province are respected in police service delivery, in the prosecution of crimes, in all of the extrajudicial matters like restorative justice and other diversion programs? How are they ensuring that the justice system is just? Because even if you're not black, you should realize that you have a vested interest in ensuring that the rights of all Nova Scotians are respected in these spaces. Because if they're not respected for one group, then the whole integrity of the system is called in question, and no one can be certain that their rights will be adhered to.
And so when we talk about that sort of stuff, the implementation of the FTANS policy, the appointment of a future permanent director of the Public Prosecution Service, what role does ANSJI play in that?
Well, ANSJI has a responsibility to keep the public informed about the work that they're doing and to keep these issues front and center in the minds of Nova Scotians. We also have the responsibility to be representing clients and to be supporting the education of lawyers, both within PPS and in other spaces, to ensure that all practitioners in the systems understand their responsibility for dismantling the systemic racism that exists. That's our job. And I think we're doing a fantastic job with the resources we have to do just that.